Well, thank you, Richard, for what was a very kind introduction, although it is the second time, I think, that I've ever been outed in that fashion as a Lancastrian, which is never something I enjoy having revealed. You know, I lived it down all through my school days that I wasn't, born in Wales. It's because my father was teaching at Lancaster University. I've never forgiven him for it. It was his 70th birthday on yesterday, and I still raised it with him. As to what he was doing, leaving Wales to go and live in Lancaster just for me to be born. It was actually when I stood in Blaenau Gwent in the by-election in 2006 that I was outed the first time. And I remember the Western Mail did a double-page spread on the day of the election. Who says the Western Mail's biased? On the day of the election, the headline was literally, "Labour candidate lies." And inside it said, Smith has been saying he's from Pontypridd throughout the campaign. He's actually, we can reveal, from Morecambe. 2 pages they ran on the basis of this headline. It's been a funny day I've had today, so if I am slightly discombobulated, you will forgive me. I've had the Daily Mail on the phone to me in the last 10 minutes, so I was slightly late. I was parking my car outside, and a Daily Mail journalist rang up to ask me about my tax affairs in the light of Lord Fink's suggestion today that everybody avoids tax, don't they? We're all at it, he said. So the Daily Mail rang me to ask me about my tax affairs, and I had the great pleasure of telling them that I'm overdrawn, thoroughly broke, and I have got a pension, but not an ISA, and I'm not dodging any tax anywhere as far as I'm aware of. But that is sort of the nature of this job. And then I come to give a talk this evening to an audience in Cardiff about Westminster. Now, it is a brave man, I think, who sings the praises of Westminster anywhere in Britain these days. Perhaps less so sometimes in Wales, but it's a brave thing to do. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Grateful of Richard and the Wales Governors Centre for inviting me this evening, and pleased to talk about it. And what I thought I'd talk about this evening is the relationship between Wales and Westminster, the relationship between our country and Westminster in its broader sense, really, as the government of Britain. Westminster has increasingly become like Washington in America, a swear word almost, spat out. It's quite extraordinary how quickly that's happened. We know why. It's partly about expensive scandals, but actually it's getting, I think, it's something much more deep-rooted, much more fundamental in people's sense of disaffection from government, and people's sense of government, society, its governance structures more broadly, including politics, just not working for people at all levels, not just people with little money, but people with a large amount of money, even, I think, in this country now feel that the governance structures we have don't work. And I also want to talk a bit about the challenges that we face, uniquely challenges we face in Wales, and collectively challenges we face as the UK and as a community of nations, if you like, across the Western industrialised world, because I think there are many shared challenges. And I thought I'd frame these thoughts about the challenges for Wales and the challenges for the UK against 3 ideas that sort of govern my politics, if you like. One is patriotism, the other one is partnership, and the third is progress. I am a progressive politician. I believe that we will move forward and must move forward. That sense of progress from the Enlightenment, I think, still governs politics across parties, but in particular on the left. And I don't want this to be a sort of philosophical disquisition. I'd rather it were a set of principles that you understand inform practical ideas about how we change politics and how we renew our politics. So let's start by identifying some of the challenges that face modern Wales. And I think in truth they are core challenges that face almost all of the Western ex-industrial, if you like, but certainly ex-heavy industrial economies across Europe and indeed across the world. To a greater or lesser extent, the same sort of problems in replacing work in heavy industry, in pits and mills and docks and steelworks, markets, manufacturing, face us in Wales as they face communities in the north of England or northern France or northern or central Spain or the Rust Belt of Middle America. These are the same sort of challenges. Industries that powered our economy, industries that gave shape to the culture and the ideas and the values of our communities have been eroded progressively over a long period, but with rapidity in the last 20 years. leaving behind population bases without the natural resources or now the capital resources that sustained them originally, that gave birth to them and allow them to flourish. And within those populations, the wealth and security of individuals, their sense of identity and their place within the world even, have also been eroded alongside those diminishing industries. What's the sort of picture we've got of people living within these communities? And, I'm talking in particular here about the core populations of South East Wales, the core ex-industrial areas of the North East, where the bulk of the population is in Wales, similar communities that those exist in the most populous parts of other parts of the world, as I say. Well, the reality is for many people within these communities, individuals and families, the truth is we've got a world where people are having to work harder and harder to make ends meet, to work harder and harder to be able to afford things, lifestyle, ambitions, basic things that our previous generation, and indeed my generation to some extent, I'm 45 this year, came to expect as the norm. Those sorts of ambitions and expectations are being eroded for many people, where you've got not one parent but often two parents working more than one job, not really able to afford luxuries and not even able to afford basic things. That's no longer, I think, an aberrant image that we could spot in any one of our communities. It's quite often the norm, and it's a radical shift from where we were 30 years ago. It's a radical shift from where we were even 20 years ago. And the easy thing to say here tonight, 84 days out, I think it's 2,000 and odd hours out from a general election, is to say this is all down to the Tories. The problems we got in our communities are as a result of the fact we've got a Tory government in Westminster. But and I know that isn't true, that these trends of deindustrialisation, the failure of successive governments to figure out how we meet the grave challenges we face, are much deep-rooted than that. It's not just about the current government in Westminster. But the terms of the debate, I think, have changed quite a lot over the last 5 years. The focus on those challenges and the understanding of those challenges and how we might set about solving them has sharpened up and shifted over the last few years. And it has become clearer and clearer that I think a government of the right, a Tory government in our case, but a government of the right anywhere in Europe, I don't feel has the answer to those solutions. The idea that the remedy to our problems is more market and less government, in essence, the idea that you would read in books like Britain Unchanged, the Bible of the right wing of the Tory party, the right wing that now runs the Tory party in this country, the notion that you could unchain Britain from the yoke of government, the yoke of equality, if you like, and liberate our economy and liberate our society. I think that message, that mantra, that philosophy has been busted thoroughly, just in this country as across the rest of the Western world. I don't think any of us any longer believe that that is the way for us to move forward. Because in Britain, as across the rest of the world, I think we've come to the conclusion, it's become very apparent, that our economy and our society can't any longer sustain the sort of gross inequalities in knowledge and power, in access to opportunity, in life expectation even, that are now commonplace in our communities, between our communities and in the Western world. And governments, in my view, can't any longer afford to sit on the sidelines and listen to those siren voices that tell government to butt out, to allow the market to distribute resource as efficiently as it might, for money effectively to beget further money, as has been the mantra, as has been the philosophy that's governed politics in this country for a long time. Because I think that imbalance between all of those things, the time people live on this earth, the money they're able to spend, the sorts of ambitions they're able to enjoy, the expectations of their lives and those for their children, those differences are destabilising our economy and destabilising our society. And the philosophy of a light touch regulation on the part of government and a back seat for government, if you like, no longer sustains. Because whether you're taking the long view of this or selling short in the markets, I think it's very, very clear now that the economy we've currently got just isn't delivering for ordinary people, isn't delivering for Wales, and isn't delivering for ex-industrial communities across the rest of the world. More money going to more money has been the trend. That's the other big picture that we've got to accept and recognise, that alongside this deindustrialisation has been a reversal in the traditional balance between the volume of GDP, money we generate as a society, going to wages and to workers, and that which is accrued in profits and by shareholders. Now, there's nothing wrong with profits, and there's nothing wrong with shareholders. The nonsense we've heard over the last couple of weeks about Labour's attitude to business is just that. It is nonsense. It is private industry in collaboration, very often, increasingly so, with public government, with public money, that generates wealth and jobs in our society and our economy. So there's nothing wrong with profits. We want profits. But the reality we've got to recognise is the share, the balance between profits and that which goes to ordinary people in their wages, that allows them to drive demand in our economy, but also allows them to live decent lives, has shifted inexorably, it would seem, over the last 30 years. And we, as politicians, need to do something about that. That is our job as government. And I think that's a very simple message, but one that is very often obscured and has been far too obscured over the last 20 or 30 years. Because the net effect, if you like, of allowing that philosophy to maintain and allowing it to govern the way in which we look after our people and run our economy is very clear for us in Wales. It's stagnant wages, it's an atomised, decollectivised workforce, it is difficulty for people to get on the housing ladder. These are just fundamentals that we can all see day and daily. It is that stalling in life expectation. It's quite extraordinary that having had a splurge, an enormous shift in the amount of time people can expect to live over the last 100 years due to public intervention, public health, better workplaces, all of these things, we're starting to see in certain parts of Britain, including South Wales and North East Wales, a stalling in life expectation. The volume of years people can expect to live. Now, that's something I didn't think I'd see in my lifetime, and I think it is one of the starkest reminders of the massive challenges we face. So how should a patriot and a believer in progress like me respond to these things? Well, it's not as the Tories have done in the last 5 years. It's not more of the same. It's not doubling the dose of the medicine if the medicine isn't seen to have worked. It's not that we need more market and less government, in my view, or lesser collaboration and more competition, because I think that way we will go further down the route we've gone in the last 5 years. We would see further falls in income, and Wales will continue to suffer more than other parts of the UK. Let us not forget that the numbers the Labour Party uses quite often to describe the problems people have experienced, wages fallen by £1,600 per family, the number in Wales is higher. It's nearer £1,700. Energy costs outstripping people's ability to pay. Well, energy costs are highest in Wales than anywhere else in Britain. Childcare costs soaring. Childcare costs in Wales are very, very high, higher than most other parts of Britain. And the volume of childcare that there is available, private childcare certainly, is lesser. And in a period in which public funding for things like childcare are being stretched, in particular in Wales, where we've seen such a large cut in the budget, 1.5 billion over the last 5 years, the capacity of the public sector to provide those fundamentals, childcare, in an economy in which two parents are often having to work, is being stretched and diminished. And job security, I think one of the fundamental things that people need in order to live fulfilled, balanced, decent lives, a sense that they know they have a job that they will be able to allow them to make ends meet, but also a job that gives them some degree of dignity, some sense of reward for their labour, some sense that they are valued as an individual. Well, that is being diminished before our very eyes. It's being diminished in fundamental things like the destruction of good public sector jobs as the public sector contracts, in particular in Wales, and the explosion of 0 hours insecure jobs. People are working 2 and 3 of these jobs with little sense of reward for them, little sense of value placed on them as individuals by the communities and in particular companies that employ them. And that's a fundamental shift once more in the nature of our economy, in the nature of people's lived experiences that we as politicians should be aware of and should be bloody well doing something about. Now, Welsh Government, I think, has made a great job of trying to mitigate some of these effects. I think they are rooted in an understanding of their communities, my community, our community, and I think they are also rooted in a set of values that mean they will try and mitigate these effects. And you can see it in practical things. Jobs Growth Wales has obviously been more effective at dealing with youth unemployment in Wales than the work programme has been in England. 8 times more effective, 17,000 job opportunities for people. Thereby we've had a greater reduction in youth unemployment in Wales than in other parts of Britain. There is a causal effect there between government intervention and action on the ground. Proact and react, we saw a lesser diminution of private sector jobs in 2008-9 at the height of the crisis than in other parts of Britain, relatively speaking. That's another example of the Welsh Government moving to change things. Apprenticeships, the Tories talk a lot about apprenticeships. Well, apprenticeships in England have gone down over the last 5 years, whereas in Wales we're up to record levels of apprenticeships. Not enough, nowhere near enough, to be perfectly honest. We need far more, and we need to change the culture within companies such that they recognise once more that they principally have an obligation to work with the public money that is provided for them to train a new workforce. That used to be, I think, a much clearer sense of responsibility within our companies. It needs to be once more, but it requires government to help them change culture and to incentivise people to want to make those changes. But there's one further lesson I think a patriot and a progressive takes from the last 5 years, and in thinking about the future, and that is about partnership, because we can't deliver progress, we can't really shift the dial on some of these massive epochal challenges without partnership. Partnership first between the countries of the UK, between Wales and Westminster, between Wales and the broader UK state, and partnership also between the UK as a country, as a state, and the other countries of Europe, because lots of the challenges I've just been describing can only be surmounted by a Britain that is strong and united, in my view. Constructing a tax system that allows us to properly pool risk and share rewards and to deal with the necessary redistribution of wealth from those people who have the most and those communities that have the most to those that have the least, that requires, I think, unity and the strength that comes through unity. Building an industrial strategy that would properly rebalance, that would recognise the fact that we have ex-industrial areas of Britain that fundamentally require greater investment, that require different approaches from government that will incentivise and deliver jobs and growth in those communities that otherwise would go elsewhere, otherwise would go to other parts of the country where it is easier to turn a fast buck and where it is more commercially viable now without government intervention to produce jobs. That is the way of the market. That is why we've gone topographically, obviously, but that is why we've shifted, I think, from being a country that was far more diverse in its seats of industry to one that is so concentrated in London and the South East. The way London and the South East has bounced out of the recession so rapidly and at such greater height than the rest of the country is such a reminder to us all that the nature of Britain now is fundamentally bottom heavy, and we do need a government to change that, because without government intervention the market will distribute those resources to those places where the returns on investment, the returns on capital will be the greatest, because that is the lesson of history. That is what happened over the last 30 years as those returns to capital, as I described earlier, have outstripped economic growth and wealth has been concentrated ever more thickly in a very thin tranche of an elite in this country and elsewhere across the Western world. That's the reality that has been described, I think, with great eloquence by people like Piketty and others over the last few years, but should now be evident to us all. It's very, very clear that that shift in wealth and that greater concentration of wealth in a narrow tier of people at the top of our society is now, it seems, set in cement, and it will require something quite big and heavy, i.e. a government that believes in doing it, to crack that cement and liberate the possibilities for people who are currently caught within it. The Tories aren't ever going to do that. The Tories aren't ever going to seek to incentivise industry. They're never going to seek to intervene in the market. And the reason for that is fundamentally they don't believe in it. Philosophically, they don't believe in it. You know, they haven't always been like this, but you have in my view, a Tory party right now that is pretty narrowly Thatcherite in its perspective on politics. There are men and women there who feel that they are fulfilling her or finishing off her unfinished revolution, as one of them put it to me. And their view, therefore, is that it's not their job to intervene in the market, that the market will distribute more equitably, and that competition, inequality even, isn't just a inevitable function of a capitalist society. It is a necessary function of a capitalist society that sees people competing against one another and countries competing against one another, which I think has become even more of a theme in the last few years, because that's why I think we've seen so many times ministers, UK government ministers in the last few years, from the Prime Minister down to successive Secretaries of State, coming to Wales with warm words about their relationship with Wales, with warm words about wanting partnership and the promise even of partnership, only to continue to sling mud and abandon any semblance of respect as soon as they get back to the safety of SW1. The most egregious example is, of course, the Prime Minister referring to Offers Dyke in the context of the NHS as a line between life and death. I think one of the most extraordinary and, in my view, reprehensible remarks ever made by a British Prime Minister. But even a couple of weeks ago, Stephen Crabb, my opponent, talking about the Welsh education system as worse than that of Eastern Europe. Now, he may believe that, but I don't think that is either constructive nor an effective means to engage as a British government, a UK government that surely has still a responsibility to speak for the peoples of all of the UK, including the Welsh. I don't think it's an effective way to engage in a debate about our education system or indeed about our NHS. But part of the reason for it is because they increasingly view Wales, you see, as a competitor. They are increasingly sanguine about a Britain of different blocks competing against one another. That is absolutely the way in which they are increasingly viewing Scotland. It is absolutely the way in which they are driving the debate around Scotland. It's why, in my view, so many Tory ministers were sanguine about the prospect of Scotland leaving the Union. Don't, let them believe, or you believe rather, that they were truly committed to the fight in Scotland. Perhaps for the better, in as much as if they were more committed, we might have lost Scotland from the Union. But in reality, lots of them are truly sanguine about the prospect of Britain breaking up. It's why they're also, I think, sanguine about the prospect of Wales adopting income tax varying powers. Now, there is nothing wrong in principle with Wales adopting income tax varying powers, but we need to think through the consequences of this. We need to think through what it will actually mean for Wales. Will Wales be better off or worse off as a result of having income tax varying powers? What would we do with those powers were we to have them? And crucially, what would be the consequence of our having income tax varying powers and deploying them, there being a differential rate of income tax, that solidarity tax, as it's known, for example, in Germany, that binds people together in provision of public services? What would it mean for us were there a differential? Well, I simply suggest that I think it would fuel the concerns of the Tory right wing that Wales should have a lesser influence at Westminster. I think you see that in the way in which they've pursued the debate about English votes and English laws. Wales has been peripheral to that debate, but the reality is, of course, we would be peripheral to the debate full stop if English votes on English laws were pursued as they are proposing. And if they win in May, which I roundly and squarely anticipate they will not, then they would implement changes that would see Wales's voice diminished at Westminster. Now, I don't think that devolution was ever meant to be about that. I don't think devolution was meant to diminish our voice at Westminster, diminish our ability to engage in these big debates about grand challenges that face our communities, but also face communities across the Western world. I think devolution was meant to amplify our voice. And therefore, my counsel to all of us in Wales who are patriots and progressives is that we don't give up on Westminster, that we don't give up on playing a fulsome part in the government and the governance of the entire UK. I think our values and I think our challenges are too great for us to step back from engaging in the wider politics of Britain. I think the capacity of Welsh politics, Labour politics perhaps in particular, given its rootedness in Wales and the breadth of our support in Wales and the historical weight of our politics in Wales, but politics more broadly in Wales, I think is a great amount to give to the wider UK, because I've always believed that Bakarian was wrong and Leanne Wood is wrong, and socialism in one country will never come about. And I don't think anything I've seen over the last 5 years, even with the Tory party in power, is going to change that. Because you need a UK government if you want to see a minimum wage in Wales applying that people can live on. You need a UK government if you're going to see incentives for industry to create a living wage. You need a UK government to be engaged if you're going to shift seemingly intractable forces in our energy markets, reshape them, break them up, force the energy companies that are effectively monopolistic now to pay greater attention to the needs of people for these fundamental public goods and for the ability to pay for them. And you need a UK government to be engaged in Europe if you are going to see European reforms that are going to benefit, for example, agriculture or any of the other sectors that are needing European reform in Wales and elsewhere. And take this week. You need a strong UK engaged in the debate across the world if you want security. In a week in which we've seen problems in Ukraine mounting, do we really want, I think, a diminished Welsh voice in a debate about those concerns that will undoubtedly at some point flare up once more and concern all of us? Do we really want to have a lesser voice in terms of the environmental concerns? It's been novel and interesting that environmental debate around fracking has become so salient in Wales over the last few months. And that's good. It's good that we are engaged in a debate. We're not often engaged in a debate about environment in the way in which we ought to be. But in reality, solving fracking and just not having fracking in Wales, I think, won't solve the concerns of environmentalists in Wales. This is something that needs to be addressed at a much higher level, at a much bigger level, and in fact needs to be really addressed across the Western world, because it is in part about energy security. And even this week, the HSBC scandal and the problems we've seen of individuals and indeed corporations, perhaps more problematically, evading the grasp, the reach of sovereign states, and thereby diminishing the ability of sovereign states to take money from individuals, rightly so through taxes, still in my view the price we pay for a civilized society, and redistribute those resources to pay for a public NHS, to pay for a public education system. You know, that's what tax is for, and that's why you need strong international collaboration increasingly in order to solve these problems. So Westminster, for me, still remains key to shifting some of these debates, key to influencing them. In conclusion, does that mean Westminster needs to stay as it is? Absolutely not. Because where I started was a sense that people are disaffected from politics, and Westminster has become the icon of their disaffection. So we must reform Westminster. We must have a Westminster that is much more outward looking, that is much more rooted across Britain, that is much more understanding of the needs of different communities across Britain, and that means reform. And devolution, I think, has a crucial role to play in this regard, because it can and has strengthened Wales's voice at the centre. It has given us a unity and a shape and a form that is recognised and reflected in policy making in Westminster. But in truth, it's not enough yet. In truth, successive governments, including the last Labour government, still doesn't really pay sufficient attention to the needs of Wales. And in my view, what that needs for us to achieve that greater degree of penetration, that greater salience, if you like, in the wider UK debate about our needs, is two things. One is we do need more powers in Wales. There are other areas we will need to move to, and over the weekend at Labour Party conference, I hope that we'll be making some useful announcements about how we will take forward the Silk proposals and other areas of new powers for Wales. But it also needs, I think, a revised architecture for government in Britain. We need to think about different ways in which we hardwire the thinking and the needs and the challenges of Wales into the architecture of government across the UK. In part, that's happening. It's interesting that some of this stuff has happened under the wire. You look at the creation of a joint exchequer committee that has existed now for a few months between Westminster and Wales and Scotland, thinking about some of the shared challenges now that there are some taxes being devolved to Wales. But we will need to build on that. We will need much more substantive changes to the architecture of Westminster's government, other committees, other standing frameworks that allow a greater exchange of ideas and a greater understanding and sharing of each other's issues and each other's solutions across either end of the M4. One of the ways in which we do that is, I think, reforming the upper house, the House of Lords. We've said very clearly that we think the time has come at last. People have been saying this a long time, but the time has come at last for a Senate that reflects all of the territories of the UK, all of the countries, nations and regions of the UK. I think that would be a very progressive way for us to move forward. But I think in the lower house, in the House of Commons too, we need to think about much more substantive reforms, a spider web, if you like, of connections at different levels of government that don't diminish in any way, shape or form the autonomy of Wales, but allow Wales to speak more on equal terms, in an equal partnership with a UK government. That's Carwyn's vision, it's my vision. I think when we've got a Labour government in Westminster and a Labour government in Wales, it's a vision we will be able to put into practice, and I think it will see Labour values trying to deliver some of the solutions to the grand challenges that I outlined, not just for Wales, but for the UK and indeed for the world. Thanks very much.